Some of the most essential workers in society are also the least visible. Today, we're meeting someone whose mission is to change all of that. Welcome to Behind the Button. Welcome to Behind the Button, the podcast that really lifts the lid on what goes on behind the scenes in the world of pay. I'm Laura Murphy, the CIPP's content editor, and today we're delving into the fascinating area of the psychology behind pay, something that impacts us all, whether we realise it or not. And I'm delighted to be joined today by Emily Trant. Welcome to the show, Emily.
Thank you, Laura. Nice to be here.
Here on Behind the Button, we ask our guest to leave a parting question for the next guest. And I think this is going to be a difficult one for you, so apologies in advance. I know you're super passionate about the work that you do at Stream, but if you could pinpoint the most exciting thing about your role today, what would that be?
The most exciting thing genuinely is the impact. And so for me, it's knowing that the choices I make and the work that I do actually change people's lives, right? So a big piece of work we've done over the years is really invest in savings, getting people to save. And in the last year, more than 1 million people opened a savings account with Stream. And that's a phenomenal success story. So knowing that there's people out there who have savings because of the work that I've been part of is so rewarding.
Yep, so it's sort of that giving something back within your role.
Absolutely. It's just that measurable change on people's lives and doing that at scale. And, you know, the reason I'm at Stream is that I had this epiphany one day, which is if you want to have a big impact, you need to build a big business. And I was struggling away in my own startup, doing really worthy things, but actually not reaching anybody. So coming somewhere that was scaling and reaching lots of people and the chance to shape that was so exciting.
Amazing. So I want to delve into you as a person a little bit, Emily, if that's okay.
All right,
because
fun.
The show is called Behind the Button, which obviously we want to explore the breadth of roles there are that are available, but also the phenomenal individuals that work within those roles. So was there a moment in your early life where you started to realise about money or about sort of unfairness surrounding money? Can you remember when that first was?
I don't think there was a moment where I thought about unfairness, but I grew up in a household that was very open about money. And one of the things that my parents really taught us as kids was that you had to work. So we were all expected to work from really early ages, right? I was, hustling and babysitting at the age of 11. I was working in a corner store at the age of 13. My parents paid for us to go through swim instructor training so we could have jobs. So kind of at 16, I was lifeguarding and teaching swimming. We were always expected to work and earn. And we were always expected to pay and save. And so my dad was a school teacher. And at the time, you only got paid in the months that school was there. There was no pay over the summer.
Wow.
So he would give us pocket money on a monthly basis. So we had to manage our income over a whole month, and if he spent it all, it was gone. And we had to last the summer. We'd get a little end of year bonus. And then the summer was ours to kind of stretch it through. And so conversations about money were super normal, and I knew from a young age I wanted to work in the financial services sector, but I was much more focused on being personally successful and getting lots of money rather than thinking about the system and the unfairness. That came much later in my career.
Mm-hmm. So it's obvious in the work that you do that you're super passionate about financial well-being and financial inclusion as well. But financial well-being means lots of different things to different people. So what does it mean to you, Emily, personally?
To me personally, it means the peace of mind to live the life you want to live. And that can be an incredibly modest life, or it can be a much more luxurious life. It's not about how much money you have. It's about the choices you can make. Can you handle short-term choices? Can you feel confident that you're going to have a good future? Can you do the things that make life worthwhile? I think so many people grind away just to pay the bills. And actually that is not financial well-being. But if you can do nice things, if you can have a holiday, if money isn't occupying, a huge proportion of your headspace, then you have financial well-being. So if you're sleeping at night and not thinking about it in a stressful way, that's really what it means to me.
you mentioned at the beginning, in your household, there were sort of lots of conversations around finances. So do you think that sort of led you to the career that you're in now? Or do you think there were other influences as well that sort of brought you to where you are today?
So that was certainly something that led me to be interested in financial services. But I started off in financial services, and I've done all kind of shapes and flavors of financial services and fintech. Certainly not always the most ethical. I've worked for retail derivatives trading businesses. I've worked for SME loan broking businesses. And prior to this job at Stream, with a couple of former colleagues, I co-founded a business that was really trying to take an innovation at the time, which was open banking, and build financial tools for people with cognitive impairments. So to kind of look at something that was mainly being used to help already wealthy people get a bit wealthier and say, well, what if we did something different, right? What if we used this great new technology and built for people who aren't being thought about? And we did some incredible things. We ultimately shut the business down during the pandemic, but it was very worthy. And it was that experience that made me realize I didn't want to do anything again that was just focused on helping rich people get richer. Like it just wasn't interesting enough to me. And it was really eye-opening in that startup when we were, for example, building a balance alert for people. And I've always worked kind of, steady, well-paid jobs. And so we were designing, where the balance alert should be. And we were thinking, maybe £500, right? Maybe if your bank account goes below £500, you should be alerted. And it was just a shock to me to realize how many people were living in their overdraft, and the balance alert wasn't 500 or 100 or even zero. It was minus 100 or minus 200 or minus 300. And it was such a different experience of money, and having conversations about money that were so far removed from my own experience up until that point, it totally changed me.
And I know that sort of this is something that you talk about in your podcast, The Invisible Worker. Yeah. What was the moment that you thought, I really need to start shining a spotlight on these issues and create my own podcast?
At Stream, for the last sort of 4-ish years, I've been conducting my own research. So we have a really deep database of people and we understand a lot about them. We understand how much they work, their rate of pay, how they consume that pay, how they save, how they spend. And every conversation I had with somebody who didn't live in that world made it increasingly clear that this just wasn't a known thing. Mm-hmm. Even saying things like, did you know that lots of people get paid every 4 weeks, for example, every month? So their payday isn't the same every month, was shocking to people in my social circle, and actually to a lot of people. And I realized that these kind of, deep, dry papers that I found really interesting and worthy weren't going to get there. And actually what I wanted to do was turn it into a book. I wanted to expose the invisible worker and talk about the fact that this is a majority problem, right? That most people have income patterns that look like this, and yet they're invisible kind of in two facets, both invisible to financial services because our whole ecosystem isn't designed for that fluctuating pay and fluctuating paydays, but also they're often invisible to us socially, right? So we're talking about the person who pours your coffee or collects your bins or looks after a relative. And even though they're right there and we're interacting with them, we don't see them. But to write a book, you really need all the answers. I'm not the kind of person who writes without knowing what I'm going to say. And it was incredibly hard to find the time to do that work, to do that deep thinking and work. So we said, well, what about a podcast, right? And then we can take the process of finding the answers and turn that into stories as we go. And then at some point we'll have enough to pull it back together and actually produce the thing that was the inspiration for the idea to begin with.
Wonderful. So the podcast will sort of form the basis of that book when it does come out.
I know, I'm committing myself publicly now to the book, right?
Yeah, you can't go back now,
I can't
Emily.
go back now. I've been promising it internally for about 2 years, but I think the podcast forms the basis for actually telling that story because it's most people. Mm-hmm. And yet the whole financial services ecosystem isn't designed for them, and it's just a fail.
Mm. So you mentioned that obviously the invisible worker forms a huge sort of number of the population. So how do we start to change the narrative and get those people to be more noticed and less invisible?
I think the first thing is to start to understand that those of us who make decisions tend to be in the minority. And one of the things I say a lot is if you look at the taxpayer base And if you look at the proportion of people who are basic rate taxpayers, it's about 8 in 10. So about 8 in 10 of the taxpayer base are basic rate taxpayers. And then if you look at who makes decisions, right? Who makes HR decisions? Who makes benefit decisions? Who makes pay decisions? Who builds financial services? Who makes design decisions? You're probably not a basic rate taxpayer. So just recognizing that you are the minority and that your worldview doesn't represent society as a whole is a really big starting point. And so many people are shocked by that. You know, people find it gobsmacking that if you earn a salary of, let's call it £60,000, you're close to the top 10% of earners. And a lot of people wouldn't self-describe in that way on those rates of pay.
So that is really interesting, you know, that the people that are making the decisions for the majority are in the minority, and they don't necessarily understand the problems that the majority are facing. So that's a really interesting point that you've drawn out there, and something for everybody to think about.
Yeah, I think so. Just being aware that your lived experience is not representative is a super important starting point. And then if you are in charge of making those decisions, asking the question of, well, what is the base of people I'm making decisions for, and what is their reality? Just doing a little bit of benchmarking and collecting a few pieces of data should make you better at making those decisions.
Yeah. And I think as well, you know, within the payroll community, we do sometimes describe ourselves as invisible workers in a way, not so much financially, but in terms of, you know, when you do a perfect payroll, not everybody that you've paid comes up to you and says, oh, thank you. But then obviously when payroll does go wrong, then you definitely get noticed and spoken to about it. So I do think, you know, pay professionals do suffer with that visibility problem. So how do you think that we sort of overcome that, do you think?
I completely agree that pay professionals, even if they don't have that first facet of invisibility, actually that second facet of being essential to kind of, you know, the fabric of employment, right? If I stopped getting paid, I would pretty quickly stop turning up to work.
Yeah.
Right? Like that is a big deal. It is the number one reason why I go to work. And yet you're right, we don't celebrate that. But if somebody makes a sale or launches a great campaign or puts out a brilliant podcast episode, everyone claps for them and says, well done.
Yeah.
So I don't know how we change that narrative for payroll professionals other than saying maybe it's time to take up more space, right? Rather than just quietly paying people, maybe it's hey everybody, the pay run was a success, you know, this pay period. Everybody's been paid on time, you know. Let me know if you got paid correctly. Like maybe you need to switch the narrative around and actually ask people to say, did you get the right pay? And ask people to engage with that process a bit more. Starts to kind of shine a light on the work that the payroll teams do, or even saying, this is what we did this month to make sure you were paid on time. You know, I've been in the office late and seen the finance team there at around a desk, kind of 6, 7 p.m, frantically trying to get things done for tomorrow's payday. Yeah. And me kind of going home going, I hope they got it right, because I really do want to be paid. So yeah, I think there's a little bit about taking up more space.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it is around changing that narrative, which at the CIPP we are really trying to do, increasing the profile of paid professionals and the work that they do, because pay is such an emotive topic, which I know you're acutely aware of. Yeah. You know, it enables people to go about their day-to-day lives, to pay their mortgages, to put food on the table, to have days out with their children. So I think, you know, the emotive sort of power of pay is massive. Do you think organisations fully appreciate how emotive pay is for their staff?
No, not at all. Not at all. I don't think we as individuals appreciate how emotive pay is and how emotional we are about the decisions we make around pay and money. And, you know, I was digging into the old kind of Turner Commission review a while ago, so way back when the idea of pensions auto-enrollment was just being thought of. And I found this data point in this long document that described 0.5% of the population behave in a way that's economically rational, right? 99.5% of us are not rational, right? And some of that is just a consequence of behavioural biases. We find it hard to think for the long term. Some of that is, you know, do we really rationally think about, what we're spending our lunch money on, or are we, much more, what do I feel like eating? We're not kind of calculating, calories per pound spent or what have you. But I think there's an assumption that people think very rationally about money and pay, and it's very, very different. And let me give you a thought experiment for this, Laura. So imagine you have £1,000, and I want you to think about the different ways you could have £1,000. So think about £1,000 from pay, and then think about £1,000 in a savings account. And then think about winning £1,000 on a scratch ticket, right? Or getting £1,000 bonus or commission check, or getting £1,000 of inheritance. And I guarantee you were already mentally assigning jobs to those different £1,000, right?
100%.
The pay is for boring stuff, right? The pay is for bills and groceries and all those other bits and pieces. Savings, you might have a kind of 2 different jobs for savings. Maybe that's for a holiday or saving for Christmas, or maybe that's your just in case fund. The scratch card, that is free money. You are going wild with that money, right? And the bonus probably feels a little bit like a treat yourself moment, right? Like buy the thing that you were thinking maybe I shouldn't, but now you get the nice new coffee maker, or you book the holiday.
Brand new outfit. And then the inheritance, most people are very careful with, right? That's money that's kind of come down through the generation. So that gets invested and tucked away, and we're very thoughtful with it. And yet, £1,000 is £1,000. Like, in theory, it should be the same decision we make with that money rationally, but it's not. We are completely emotional about it. It's so fascinating, the psychology of pay, because as you say, it is the same amount of money, yet when you were talking, my mind was already going off in all different tangents about what I do with those different types of money. So it really is fascinating to think about the way that we think about money.
Yeah, we do think about it in a really funny way. And then we also think about money. So, for example, if you have to take money out of your current account and put it in savings, you kind of notice that. You notice that loss, right? That actually hurts. You feel like you're worse off. Whereas if you don't see it happening, so if you have a payroll savings proposition, for example, and that money gets tucked away automatically, it's like it was invisible and it never happened. So you don't feel the pain of that loss. So that makes it much easier to save, because you don't have to move that and kind of notice the money is shifting somewhere else.
It's almost that thing of inertia, isn't it? Where you're not having to think about it. And I know that's sort of why automatic enrolment with pensions has been such a success, because like you say, you've never sort of had that money almost. It automatically goes from your pay, so you don't necessarily miss it in the same way that you would if it was taken from you after sort of payday.
We also, with that kind of long-term thinking, there's this idea of time consistency or time inconsistency, which is if you're time consistent, you make the same choices for your current self and your future self. And if you're time inconsistent, you make different choices. And the classic example is going to the gym, right? So if you are time inconsistent, like most of us are, you might talk about going to the gym. You might set your alarm to go to the gym, but when the alarm goes off, you hit snooze and you think, I'll do it next time, right?
That's me.
And that's pensions and long-term saving, which is we want to do the right thing. We're happy to commit our future self to do the right thing. But when our current self bumps into that future self, we want to do the fun thing or the nice thing or the easy thing. So it's incredibly difficult to save for the long term, because that kind of wanting to have that moment of pleasure or wanting to hit the snooze button is really strong in that moment.
Yeah, and talking about savings, I know that you do, like you said earlier, a lot of sort of research at Stream.
Yeah.
And I know that you sort of came across something called the empathy gap when you were looking at how different groups of people view how other groups of people save. So could you talk to me a little bit about what the empathy gap is?
Yeah, we did a piece of research on the empathy gap and the action gap. But what we wanted to do was we wanted to look at 2 groups of people. So lower income earners and higher income earners. And so we looked at people who earned at or below £25,000 a year, and people who earned at or above £60,000 a year. And we asked them the same question. So we asked them how much they spent on groceries and housing, how much money they had left at the end of the month, how much they saved, whether they used products like overdrafts or buy now, pay later, how much they were able to participate in leisure or kind of felt like they were missing out on activities. And then we asked them to predict what the other group said. And something really interesting came out of this, which was the lower earners were really accurate at predicting the higher earners. except they kind of underestimated how much the high earners had saved, because it was sort of a mind-blowing amount. It was like £25,000 on average, which just felt unfathomable. But the higher earners persistently underestimated kind of the financial skill and capability and resilience of the lower earners, right? They thought they had a third as much money left at the end of the month. They thought they were saving kind of half as much or a third as much. They thought they were missing out on social activities much more often, 2 or 3 times more often than they did. They thought they were using products like buy now, pay later much more than they actually were. And what's interesting to me about the empathy gap is it's, if you underestimate people, if you think that their capability is a challenge or their ability to manage money is a challenge, you solve that by trying to fix the capability challenge rather than recognizing that the capability is inherently there. There's just less to start with from a resource point of view. So how do you help people optimize those resources? And it was really fascinating. We've got a report, maybe we can link to that in the show notes on the empathy gap, that found that real gap in understanding from higher earners to lower earners. And that maybe takes me back to the point earlier, which is if you are a higher earner, remember that you are in the minority. And when you are designing systems or making choices, again, think about who you're designing for, but actually really understand their capability as well.
Yeah, I was going to say it brings us full circle to what you were saying at the beginning, you know, that the people making those decisions around financial products don't necessarily understand the behaviours of the people they're designing those products for. So it's really interesting that your research sort of showed that as well.
And you hear, you know, again and again, people want to teach people how to budget or how to save. And anybody you speak to who works directly with people who do have less to go around, you know, they know how to budget. They know how to stretch every pound and penny. They know how much a loaf of bread costs. They know how much a pint of milk costs. It's not a lack of skill that's the challenge. Sometimes it's a lack of inclusive tooling. Sometimes it's a lack of deliberate design. But actually, you know, if you asked a higher earner to kind of, you know, name check the price of various basic groceries, they'd probably struggle.
So I'm going to turn now to sort of transparency around pay, because we have seen a lot of initiatives that try and encourage more transparency in that space. So it's a bit of a controversial one, but do you believe transparency around pay is always empowering, or do you think it can sometimes cause tensions between people?
Well, look, both, right? Yeah. Both is the answer. I think it's always important. And there's research that shows that when you are transparent around pay at a very basic level, so for example, if you're recruiting for a new role, putting the salary band on that job ad, that is known to decrease the gender pay gap, the ethnicity pay gap, so, you know, the disability pay gap. So allowing that external benchmark to be out there and saying this is what a role is worth is incredibly important. And it lets people both internally and externally understand where they are and actually if they are being paid a fair amount. It's uncomfortable because, you know, our sense of self and our sense of value can be connected to pay, and it might not feel nice to know that the work that we do isn't as highly valued as the work that somebody else does, but it's important. And I think we should sit with that discomfort.
Yeah. And, you know, we were having a chat beforehand and we were talking about, you know, how two people receiving the same salary, one could view their salary as, you know, a great thing, whereas the other person earning that exact same figure might feel like they're being paid unjustly. So talk to me about that, Emily, because that was really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it's all about kind of relativity and how we benchmark against our peers. So, and again, there's been studies done on this, which is imagine that you earn, let's pick a number, £70,000, and everybody around us earns £80,000, or you earn £60,000 and everybody around you earns £50,000. So in one example, you're earning less than everybody else. The other example, you're earning more. But when you're earning less than everybody else, you're actually objectively earning more money. Mm-hmm. Most people choose the other option. They would rather be paid less, but know that they're out earning their peers. So when that's put to people, you know, what would you choose? We want to be better off, right? We want to be more impressive. So the actual amounts don't matter. So you could be in the same role, earning the same amount, but feeling like your work is worth more, or you work harder, or actually your social circle is much more well off than you, or your social your circle is much less well off than you. And so how you feel about that pay will change based on all of that context. So there's no kind of objective real answer. And again, that comes back to the transparency point. That's why it's uncomfortable, but also important.
Yeah, I mean, when you told me that stat, I thought that is wild.
Yeah.
But it's part of why sort of the psychology around pay is so fascinating, because things that you think, that just doesn't make sense, is how people operate and how they think.
Yeah, and pay reviews and why, you know, the rising minimum wage, which is kind of squeezing the gap between entry-level workers and line managers, is leaving line managers feeling a little bit disgruntled with the state of the world. Even though they are earning more, the perception is they're not earning enough more for the work that they're doing. So even at a higher rate of pay, and even though those minimum wages are driving up everybody's rate of pay, it can leave some people feeling worse off.
Yeah, we hear a lot of that around sort of squeezed pay differentials when they uplift the national minimum wage and national living wage every year. You know, people are saying, I don't want to take on these additional responsibilities for money that it doesn't feel sufficient for those responsibilities.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's definitely something that we've heard at the CIPP as well. So again, talking about feelings around pay, I want to talk to you a little bit around sort of the frequency at which people receive pay. So you mentioned earlier, a lot of employees get paid on a 4-weekly or lunar cycle, but then we also have people that are paid weekly and monthly. In your research, have you seen that the frequency of pay impacts how people consume and use that pay?
Yeah, and you know what? There's research that kind of tells opposite sides of the story, so you can choose your favorite and decide which story you want to tell. So you can find research that shows that people on a more frequent pay cadence, or a weekly pay cadence, budget better because it's easier to create and stick to a plan over a short time period. You know, that kind of feeling of time inconsistency doesn't come in as strongly. You will also see research that says a more frequent pay period can, you know, increase consumption, and you'll see the opposite that says paying somebody monthly or less frequently can give you this feeling of being quite rich on payday, and so then you kind of over consume and overspend, and then you find it harder to manage the rest of the pay period. There's not really a right or wrong answer. It's a whole systems design challenge, and actually one of the hard things about people who are on that cadence that isn't monthly, like a lunar pay cycle that's every 4 weeks, is just that drift. So when you have a long pay cycle and it's not aligned with how your bills are due, that's much more challenging to manage than a short pay cycle where you can kind of adjust as you go. There's also research that finds that where you have the choice as to how much to work, the closer you are to a payday, the more willing you are to work. So a short pay cycle can allow you to almost sort of override that desire not to work and you know, take some leisure and do the nice thing and be more willing to work because the reward is much, much closer.
And, you know, pay cycles, that brings me nicely on to earned wage access or EWA. So for anybody listening or watching today who isn't familiar with what EWA is, could you just give us a quick sort of summary of what earned wage access is?
Yeah, so earned wage access is the idea that you can be paid for the work you've done when you've completed that work. So it's not about a pay advance. So imagine, let's pick a date. Imagine it's the 10th of the month. You cannot be paid for the whole of the month. You could be paid for the first 10 days of the month if you've done that work. So it just puts control back into the individual and recognizes that pay cycles actually weren't designed for people. Pay cycles were designed for businesses and for business cash flow and business convenience, but that as individuals, our choice is to manage our money the way we want. So if we've done the work but not been paid for it, earned wage access is a mechanism to allow you to access that pay.
Yeah, so it's almost giving empowerment to the worker in terms of they can sort of decide when they draw down that money that they've already earned.
Yeah, and it's acknowledging that, worked, if you've done the work but not been paid, actually it's a debt from your employer. Your employer owes you that money. And in most debtor-creditor relationships, the power dynamic is reversed, right? If I take a loan from my bank, I don't tell them when I'm paying it back. They tell me, right? And so, but in the employer-employee relationship, we have this interesting dynamic where we're gifting our time to our employer And they're saying, and we think we will pay, we will pay our debts when we decide. And that we decide could be monthly, 4-weekly, what have you. So it just sort of readjusts that power dynamic and says, actually, you owe me the money and I can choose when I want to have it.
Yeah, so I think EWA has grown quite a lot in sort of visibility over the past few years. And I know that Stream formed part of the CIPP's EWA working group. So sort of why was that group established? And I know that as a working group, you put together a code of conduct for EWA. What does that code of conduct almost say about using EWA in organisations?
Well, the working group was formed off the back of a paper that was written in 2021 by Chris Woolard, and it was known as the Woolard Review, and it was an exploration of innovation in the unsecured credit market. And it looked at things like buy now, pay later, which is now kind of coming into regulation, and also innovations like earned wage access. And it recommended that to the FCA that earned wage access remain unregulated because it's not a credit product, it's being paid for the work that you've done, but that there should be some sort of standard that the industry adheres to ensure that there's still a focus on good consumer outcomes, that people who use the product can understand what to expect, and that there's kind of recourse if things don't go the way they want to, that they're able to kind of raise a complaint and get help. And so the industry came together, who were operating at the time, to say, actually, we should do this. We should listen to this paper. We should take the advice and we should do the work to define what best practice looks like for earned wage access, particularly because it's a booming product area, certainly in the UK, the US as well, and overseas. And it's not executed as well in some markets. So there was a concern that actually somebody could come into the UK market and begin delivering a product that didn't lead to good consumer outcomes. So how do we define best practice, and how do we make sure that anybody who wants to operate here is doing it in a way that's kind of respected, understood, and helpful. And so the principles of the Code of Practice are really about exactly that: good consumer outcomes, good product design, really clear communication so people understand what they're doing, the ability to access support, a very specific focus on vulnerability and actually measuring outcomes for vulnerable customers, as well as service design and a few other things. And what's really important is this is an audited standard, right? So it's not just a self-referral, pat yourself on the back, tick the boxes, we did a good job. There was a commitment to be independently assessed to ensure that you do comply with the standards. And that assessment process takes about a week. So it's not a small effort to have a firm come in who assesses the whole market and then certifies them as compliant.
So it's all around sort of making sure that EWA is implemented in the right way and that people using that sort of service are protected, I guess.
Yeah, that they understand what they're doing, that they're protected, that they're getting value for money, and that even some of the edge cases are actually thought about and looked after, so with really deliberate design. And it aligns quite closely with the FCA's consumer duty standards.
So you mentioned the US there.
Yeah.
And I know that sort of you've done research all around the globe about the labour market and how it operates. So how do you think the UK operates in comparison? Because I know certainly we have a tendency in the UK to think we have it really bad here sometimes, but from speaking to you I know that isn't necessarily the case. So yeah, how do you think the UK compares to labour market practices on a global scale?
I mean, the UK generally has very strong labour market and very strong worker protections. If I pick something like the national minimum wage or national living wage, the UK is pretty much top of the league tables in the OECD. And actually that's been going on since around 2016 with the Low Pay Commission. There's been a deliberate policy to upweight the minimum wage so that it reaches 2/3 of the median. So it's described as the bite out of the median wage. If I look at how that compares to the US minimum wage is about 29% of the median. So here in the UK, we're kind of around 2/3, maybe slightly above it. In the US, it's way below. And actually, again, OECD average sits around 50-60%. So we are leading in terms of the amount that we pay people. And I think a lot of that comes from the effort of the Real Living Wage campaign that kind of put this on the political agenda and drove this. The UK, compared to the rest of the OECD, is okay on things like maternity pay and kind of paternity pay, does very poorly on sick pay. So kind of prior to SSP reform, if you took an extended period of sick pay off on statutory, you would be getting around an income replacement level of 11%, whereas again the OECD sits more about 50%. The US is its own world, right? So the US has a very low federal minimum wage of $7.25 an hour, which hasn't changed since 2015.
Wow.
It has no entitlement to maternity pay, no entitlement to paternity pay, no entitlement to sick pay, and no entitlement to holiday or vacation pay, and not mandatory for a pension to be offered. So it's a fundamentally very different shape of labour market, and actually you have much lower paid workers. So across the US, there's not a single state where the state minimum wage is close to adequate, right? There's not a single state where you could be a single income household, even with no children, and earn a sufficient living on the minimum wage. Whereas in the UK, because of the work we've done, actually that is sufficient for a lot of people if you are earning a minimum wage kind of at a full-time gig.
Yeah, I mean, that thing about America with no sick pay and certainly maternity pay, that to me seems absolutely terrifying. So yeah, I do think, we do have some good systems in place in the UK. I was going to ask you if you think there's any sort of global practices you think we should be adopting here in the UK from your experience?
I really think if we look at Sweden and how they have delivered matched parental leave or kind of paid parental leave, there's two things that I think are really important from a labour market perspective. The first is that if you're on maternity leave in Sweden, you can flex it. So you can use that leave until your child is maybe 5. So you can return to work part-time and be working part-time and on leave part-time and kind of manage your work-life balance really effectively. The second thing that Sweden did was that they issued parental leave to, fathers or the second partner, and they made it use it or lose it. And again, it's well paid. It's at around 80% of salary. And that was just created a cultural change where actually the father or the second parent had to use that leave or it disappeared. And that has changed the way that people parent, and it's really important for gender equality. So I think that's one thing we can take from Sweden. I think in the US, coming back to the pay frequency point, the standard of being paid every other week, actually for a lot of people would make a big difference. Having more frequent pay can help you manage your money more effectively. And the cultural attitudes around pay, which is people feel very entitled to their pay and they're very open about pay, is maybe something we could learn a little bit from.
Yeah, I want to come back to sort of the point you made about Sweden and the gender sort of equality. So when we hear about the gender pay gap, we hear a lot about sort of abstract figures without sort of any reasoning behind that. So how much do you think the gender pay gap is actually down to expectations placed on mothers around childcare?
Oh, a huge, most of it. So 80% of the gender pay gap is the motherhood pay gap, right? So most of the gender pay gap happens when women have children. And then the gender pay gap is not about me and somebody else doing the same job and getting different rates of pay. It's about collectively as a society, how we value women's work compared to men's work and the pay that each group receives. And women do much more part-time work. Women, I think, are 3 times as likely as men to be in part-time work. And women do much more unpaid labour. So it's this kind of unpaid economy propping up the real economy, we'll call it, which contributes to that gap. And it's because work is not designed for a 2-income household. Childcare is not designed for a 2-income household. And even decisions about whether you keep working and pay for nursery, we're making those decisions badly, right? We're making those decisions based on maybe my income or somebody else's income, rather than saying, actually, as a household, what does that look like? And should I really forego income now? What that's actually doing to me is it's costing me my ultimate top-level income down the line, right? The gap now might look quite challenging in terms of managing that, but what I'm doing is I'm foregoing the last 5 or 10 years of my career potential earnings by kind of tightening that up. So I think there's a whole systems change piece that needs to happen. I think I was saying to you before about unpaid labour and kind of the difference between what men and women do. And I find this really wild. So I was looking at the data from the ONS on unpaid labour, and anything that could be in the paid economy that you do yourself is unpaid labour. So doing your own dishes, looking after your own children. But transport is part of it too, right? So if I drive myself to work, but I could be paying to take a bus, that's unpaid labour. And the biggest contributor to men's unpaid labour is driving, right? So it's driving themselves to work. And then there's also data that shows that when you have kids, you tend to move further from city centres. Men's commute distances don't change. They continue to go to work. So they drive themselves in, doing their unpaid labour, good for them. And they continue to earn those higher wage jobs. Whereas women stay back more locally and they find work that's a shorter commute. So their commute distance drops quite substantially because they're doing all the other things. So they have less opportunity. So, I could go on about this for the rest of the podcast, Laura. You got to cut me off here.
Well, some of those stats are shocking.
Yeah.
And, we want to look at this in a positive way. So there's obviously a problem there that needs addressing.
Yeah.
What do you think organisations can be doing to ensure that childcare responsibilities aren't disproportionately falling on women instead of men?
Have a matched parental leave policy. This is so important. I cannot overstate how important this is. This was my experience of having kids. My experience of having kids was I was working for little startups that had a statutory policy, so it wasn't very generous for me. My husband was working for big corporates that gave him 6 months fully paid parental leave. So it was a no-brainer for me to do the first half, go back to work, and for him to pick up the second half. And that does lots of different things. That gave him the privilege of learning how to parent without me watching over his shoulder and telling him he was doing it wrong. That made him see himself as a primary parent. And that meant that all of the labour around choosing the nursery, choosing the schools, joining the WhatsApp groups, being the person who's the default pickup parent, it just got spread. We both did that job, and that changed the way that we both parent. It changed the way that we think about or expect whose job is it to do those things. And it made it so that I could go back and keep working in a way that was important to my career. And it also allowed him to experience the downside of taking that time off, which is, the loss of opportunity, the discrimination. And honestly, more men need to experience that firsthand to know that it's real.
And I know when we caught up before the podcast, I was talking about sort of the working mom, and you were saying you prefer to call it the working parent.
Yeah.
Because even in sort of the language that we use, we automatically put the responsibility onto the mother. So that brings me sort of to my next and almost final question for you, Emily. So how much of this problem is a cultural challenge, and how much is it a policy change that's needed in this space?
Yeah, I'm going to fudge the answer and say it's both.
Yep.
But the policy needs to come first, right? The policy needs to change before the culture can change. And going back to the Sweden example, Sweden had the ability to share leave equally between parents already for a long time, but nobody was taking it up, right? The men weren't taking time off because they didn't want to affect their career, or, lots of other reasons why you can come up with. And it was only when they mandated that this is the time for you, and you must take it and it's paid or you will lose it, then the culture change happened. And so policy leads, culture follows. And I think we need to make it make sense for people financially.
Thank you for that. So as we put sort of the last guest question to you, I'm going to ask you for one last favour, Emily, if that's okay. So could you give me your question for our next guest on Behind the Button, please?
Yes, this is something I've been obsessing over, Laura. This is my question, and it's a bit of a payroll question. Why, on your payslip, is your pension contribution presented as a deduction? It drives me nuts. It is an investment. Why are we showing it as a minus item and not a plus item? Can we not help people see their pension as an investment, see themselves as investors by repositioning that change on the payslip? Why? Is there a technical reason? Why must we show it as a deduction?
Yeah, so that we're framing it in more of that positive light.
Yeah.
And that brings us back to what we were talking about earlier about flipping the narrative on things.
Yes.
Because at the moment, your pension comes out next to tax.
Yeah.
I don't think people necessarily see tax as a positive thing on their payslip. So yeah, I think that's a really insightful question. I think we'll get some good answers on that.
And can we change it?
Yes. Well, thank you so much for your time today. I've really enjoyed today's episode, Emily.
Thanks, Laura.
We hope you enjoyed this episode. Don't forget to hit subscribe or follow Behind the Button on your favourite podcast player. And if you're watching us on YouTube, tap the like button, drop us a comment and make sure you subscribe so you never miss an episode. We've got lots more great guests lined up to tell their payroll stories and lots of guests you may have missed too. And we'd love to get questions, suggestions and stories direct from you. Just email behindthebutton@cipp.org.uk. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks for tuning in and we'll see you next time.